The words that every American schoolchild learns are polished like marble, smooth and cold and permanent, a date which will live in infamy. The phrase rolls off the tongue with the certainty of scripture, as if Franklin Delano Roosevelt had spoken it instinctively, as if the words had simply emerged from some deep well of presidential wisdom the moment the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. But history, as it so often does, conceals more than it reveals. The speech that defined a generation, that pulled a reluctant nation into the largest war humanity has ever known, was not born in a flash of inspiration. It was forged in panic, revised in fury, and spoken by a man who, in the private hours before he addressed Congress, had said things far different from the measured tones the world would come to remember. On the afternoon of December 7, 1941, when word first reached the White House that Japanese aircraft were raining fire upon the Pacific Fleet, the 32nd President of the United States did not speak of infamy. He did not speak of history. He spoke instead the single, raw syllable that escapes the lips of ordinary men when the unthinkable arrives at their doorstep. He said no. And in that moment, before the speechwriters gathered and the generals called and the machinery of war began to turn, Franklin Roosevelt was not a president. He was simply a man who could not believe what he was hearing. The White House had been quiet that Sunday, wrapped in the thin December light that filtered through the bare trees along Pennsylvania Avenue. A cold front had moved through Washington the night before, leaving the grass stiff with frost that had not quite melted by midday. Inside the residential quarters, the smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the faint mustiness of old books and the sharper scent of the cigarettes that Roosevelt smoked in their long ivory holders. He was in his study on the second floor, a cluttered room filled with naval prints and model ships and the accumulated debris of a lifetime spent in love with the sea. His stamp collection lay open before him, the small squares of colored paper offering their usual escape from the weight of a world that seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. Harry Hopkins, the president's closest advisor and confidant, sat across from him in a leather chair that had grown soft with use. Hopkins was a thin man, gaunt, reculé, his body ravaged by the stomach cancer that would eventually claim his life. But his mind remained sharp as broken glass, and on this particular afternoon, he was discussing the latest dispatches from the negotiations with Japan. The talks had grown increasingly tense over the past months. Japan's ambassador had been making demands that Roosevelt knew he could not accept, and the president had been playing for time, hoping that sanctions and diplomacy might somehow prevent the conflict that military advisors had been warning was inevitable. The telephone rang at approximately 1:40 in the afternoon. Roosevelt's naval aide, Frank Knox, was on the line, and even before he spoke, there was something in the quality of the silence that made the president grip the receiver more tightly. Knox's voice came through the wire in fragments, each word carrying the weight of disbelief. "Air raid. Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." Roosevelt listened, and those who were present in the room would later recall how the color drained from his face, how his jaw tightened, how for a long moment he seemed unable to form words at all. And then, finally, he spoke. No, that can't be right. It was not the reaction of a statesman preparing to address his nation. It was the reaction of a man confronting the destruction of everything he had worked to prevent. For Roosevelt had spent the better part of 2 years trying to keep America out of the war that was consuming Europe and threatening to engulf Asia. He had maneuvered and negotiated and delayed, believing that time was on his side, that the American public would eventually come to see the necessity of intervention without being dragged into it by disaster. And now, in the space of a single telephone call, all of that careful diplomacy had been rendered meaningless. Eleanor Roosevelt was hosting a luncheon in another part of the White House when the news began to spread. The First Lady had invited a small group of guests, and the conversation had been pleasant, if unremarkable. touching on charity work and the difficulties of maintaining social programs during wartime austerity. She noticed one of the servants whispering urgently to another, noticed the way certain faces went pale, noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere that precedes catastrophic news. When she finally learned what had happened, her first thought was not of the strategic implications or the political ramifications. Her first thought was of her 4 sons, all of them of military age, all of them now destined for the very conflict she had prayed they might avoid. The hours that followed the initial report were marked by a peculiar quality of time, the way minutes seem to stretch and compress when crisis descends. Roosevelt made phone calls, dozens of them, to cabinet members and military commanders and congressional leaders. His voice on these calls was different from the measured, patrician tones that Americans heard on his fireside chats. There was an edge to it, a barely contained fury that those who knew him well had rarely witnessed. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrived at the White House, Roosevelt greeted him with words that have been largely forgotten by history. "My God," he said, "how did this happen? How did we let this happen?" The question was not merely rhetorical. In the chaos of that first afternoon, no one could yet understand the magnitude of the failure that had allowed the attack to succeed. Reports were still coming in, fragmentary and often contradictory, painting a picture of devastation that grew worse with each passing hour. The Arizona sunk. The Oklahoma capsized. Hangars burning, aircraft destroyed on the ground, oil fires spreading across the harbor until the very water seemed to be ablaze. Roosevelt sat in his study, his cigarette burning down to ash between his fingers, and listened as the scope of the disaster revealed itself. What he said in those private hours bears little resemblance to the speech that would later enter the history books. He cursed, according to some accounts, using language that rarely escaped his lips in polished company. He questioned the competence of his military advisors, demanded to know why the fleet had been so vulnerable, why the warnings that now seemed obvious in hindsight had not been heeded. Grace Tully, his personal secretary, would later describe his mood as one of controlled rage, the kind of anger that burns cold rather than hot, that hardens into determination rather than dissipating into despair. But beneath the anger, there was also something else. Roosevelt was, above all else, a politician of extraordinary skill, and even as he grappled with the emotional reality of the attack, part of his mind was already turning to the challenge that lay ahead. He would need to address the nation. He would need to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And he would need to find words that could transform shock and grief into unity and purpose. The speech that he would deliver the following day had to accomplish something that no American president had attempted since Woodrow Wilson in 1917. It had to take a nation that had been deeply divided over the question of intervention and forge from that division a single, unshakable resolve. The drafting of the speech began that evening as the last light faded from the December sky and the windows of the White House glowed yellow against the darkness. Roosevelt did not delegate this task to his speechwriters, though he had a talented team at his disposal. He understood instinctively that the words he spoke would echo far beyond the walls of Congress, that they would be remembered long after the war itself had faded into history. And so he took up his pen himself, writing in the cramped, angular hand that his secretaries had learned to decipher, scratching out phrases and inserting new ones as he searched for the perfect formulation. The first draft contained a phrase that has been largely forgotten. Roosevelt originally wrote that December 7th would be a date which will live in world history. It was an accurate statement, certainly, and one that captured the global significance of what had occurred. But as he read the words back to himself, something felt wrong. The phrase was too passive, too clinical, too removed from the raw emotion that was sweeping through the nation. World history suggested textbooks and scholars, the dry analysis of events from a comfortable distance. It did not capture the fury, the betrayal, the moral outrage that Roosevelt knew Americans were feeling. He crossed out the words and wrote again, "A date which will live in infamy." The change was subtle but profound. Infamy was not a neutral term. It carried with it centuries of moral weight, the suggestion of deliberate evil, of treachery so profound that it demanded not merely response, but righteous retribution. In choosing that single word, Roosevelt was not simply describing an event. He was framing it, shaping how Americans would understand and remember what had happened. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely a military action. It was an act of betrayal, a violation of the unwritten codes that supposedly governed relations between civilized nations. What Roosevelt really said, in the totality of those terrible 24 hours, was far more complex than the polished phrases that history has preserved. He said no. He said, "How did this happen?" He said, "My God, and this changes everything, and we will make them pay." He said things that were petty and things that were profound, things born of fear and things born of fury. He was, in those hours, simply human, struggling to comprehend an event that had shattered the assumptions upon which he had built his foreign policy. Throughout the night, as Roosevelt refined his speech, aides came and went from his study. The smell of coffee grew stronger as the hours passed. Mingling with tobacco smoke and the faint scent of the pomade Roosevelt used to slick back his hair. Reports continued to arrive, each one adding new details to the catastrophe. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled. The Japanese were launching simultaneous attacks across Southeast Asia, striking at the Philippines and Malaya and Hong Kong. What had begun as a single devastating raid was revealing itself to be the opening move in a carefully coordinated campaign of conquest. Roosevelt's son James was in the White House that night, and he would later describe the strange intimacy of watching his father work on the speech. The president sat at his desk, a wool blanket draped over his withered legs. His reading glasses perched on his nose, looking less like a world leader than like an aging professor grading papers by lamplight. But the intensity of his concentration was unmistakable. He would write a phrase, pause, speak it aloud to test its rhythm, then either nod in satisfaction or scratch it out and begin again. The speech was short by design. Roosevelt understood that brevity would convey determination, that a lengthy address would dilute the emotional impact of what he needed to say. But brevity did not mean simplicity. Every word was chosen with care, weighed for its connotations and its cadence. Roosevelt was a master of the English language, perhaps the most skilled orator ever to occupy the presidency, and he brought all of that skill to bear on the task before him. He knew that this speech would be quoted for generations, that schoolchildren not yet born would study its phrases and debate its meaning. And he knew that the words he chose would help shape how Americans understood their role in the conflict to come. The morning of December 8th dawned cold and gray over Washington. Roosevelt had slept only a few hours, if at all. But those who saw him that morning described a man who seemed somehow larger than he had the day before. The shock and anger had crystallized into something harder, a kind of steely calm that would characterize his leadership throughout the war years. He dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit and a dark tie, understanding that his appearance would carry its own message. He would look like a commander-in-chief, even if he could not walk like one. The drive to the Capitol was made in an open car, a decision that horrified the Secret Service but which Roosevelt insisted upon. He wanted the American people to see their president, to know that he was not hiding behind bulletproof glass or cowering in fear. The streets were lined with spectators, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes following the presidential motorcade with an intensity that seemed almost physical. Many of them had been awake all night, listening to the radio, trying to comprehend how the world had changed so completely in the space of a single afternoon. Inside the House chamber, the atmosphere was electric with grief and determination. Congressmen and senators sat shoulder to shoulder, their usual partisan divisions temporarily forgotten. Eleanor Roosevelt was in the gallery, along with other members of the president's family. The justices of the Supreme Court were present, as were members of the diplomatic corps, their faces arranged in expressions of professional neutrality that could not quite conceal the tension beneath. When Roosevelt entered, supported by his son James on one side and a cane on the other, the chamber rose as one, the applause beginning spontaneously and continuing for what seemed like an eternity. What Roosevelt really said in those moments before he began to speak has never been recorded. His lips moved slightly as he arranged his papers on the podium, perhaps rehearsing the opening lines one final time, perhaps saying a silent prayer. The room fell gradually quiet, the last coughs and whispers dying away, until the only sound was the soft creak of the wooden seats and the distant rumble of traffic on Constitution Avenue. And then, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the chamber, Roosevelt began to speak. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The words fell into a silence so profound that Roosevelt's voice seemed to fill not just the chamber, but the entire nation. Millions of Americans were listening on the radio, gathered around their sets in living rooms and kitchens and country stores, their faces turned toward the speakers as if toward an altar. They heard not just the words, but the controlled anger beneath them, the deliberate cadence that transformed simple sentences into something approaching poetry. What struck many listeners was not the famous opening line, but what followed. Roosevelt cataloged the attacks with a precision that bordered on the liturgical. Japan has attacked Malaya. Japan has attacked Hong Kong. Japan has attacked Guam. Japan has attacked the Philippine Islands. Japan has attacked Wake Island. Japan has attacked Midway Island. The repetition was deliberate, each new target adding weight to the case for war, building inexorably toward the conclusion that Roosevelt had known from the first moment he learned of the attack. There could be no negotiation now. There could be no compromise. There could only be war, prosecuted with every resource the nation could muster until final victory was achieved. But what the public did not hear, what has been largely lost to history, was the speech that Roosevelt did not give. In the drafts that preceded the final version, there were passages that were angrier, more detailed, more focused on assigning blame. There was a section that detailed the ongoing negotiations with Japan, that suggested the attack had come while peace talks were still in progress, that emphasized the treachery of striking without warning. Roosevelt removed much of this material, understanding that his purpose was not to litigate the past, but to unite the nation for the future. He also removed a passage that dwelt on the casualties, the names of ships sunk, the estimates of lives lost. His advisors had warned him that the full scope of the disaster was not yet known, that figures mentioned in the speech might later prove inaccurate. But beyond that practical consideration, Roosevelt sensed that too much focus on the losses would shift the emotional register of the speech from determination to grief. He wanted Americans to feel angry, not sad. He wanted them to feel ready for sacrifice, not overwhelmed by mourning. The speech was engineering as much as rhetoric, each element calculated to produce a specific emotional response. The vote that followed the speech was almost unanimous. Only one member of Congress, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against the declaration of war. She was a committed pacifist who had also voted against American entry into the First World War, and she would spend the rest of her life defending her decision. As she cast her lonely vote, she was heckled by her colleagues, called a traitor, and worse. The unity that Roosevelt had sought to create was real, but it was also brittle, already beginning to generate the kind of fierce conformism that would characterize the home front in the years to come. Roosevelt returned to the White House that afternoon as a wartime president, his role fundamentally transformed. The hesitation and caution that had marked his foreign policy for the previous 2 years had been swept away, replaced by a single-minded focus on victory. He would make mistakes in the months ahead, strategic and moral errors that historians continue to debate. The internment of Japanese Americans, authorized just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, would stand as one of the great stains on his legacy. But in the immediate aftermath of the speech, such complications lay in the future. For now, there was only the president's voice, still echoing in the minds of those who had heard it, and the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the American experience. What Roosevelt really said when Pearl Harbor was attacked cannot be reduced to a single famous phrase. It was the accumulation of everything he said in those terrible hours, the private curses and public declarations, the questions and the commands, the moments of doubt and the assertions of confidence. It was the word "no" when he first heard the news, and the word "infamy" when he addressed the nation. It was the silence between the words, the pauses that let the weight of the moment settle over his listeners. It was not just what he said, but how he said it. The tone of controlled fury that transformed a political speech into something that approached the sacred. In the weeks and months that followed, Americans would repeat certain phrases from the speech until they became part of the national vocabulary. A date which will live in infamy. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. These words became talismans, repeated in factories and military camps, printed on posters and carved into monuments. They were the verbal equivalent of the flag, symbols that could unite strangers in common purpose. But Roosevelt himself rarely spoke of the speech in the years that followed. When aides or journalists asked about its composition, he deflected with jokes or changed the subject. Perhaps he understood that the words had taken on a life of their own, that they no longer belonged to him, but to the nation as a whole. Or perhaps he remembered too clearly the less polished moments, the cursing and the questioning, and the raw uncertainty of those first hours. The Roosevelt of legend, calm and confident in the face of crisis, was partly a creation of that famous speech. The real Roosevelt had been just as frightened and confused as anyone else. The word infamy itself tells us something important about how Roosevelt understood the moment. It comes from the Latin infamia, meaning ill fame or bad reputation. To call something infamous is to judge it morally, to place it in a category of acts so terrible that they deserve eternal condemnation. By choosing that word, Roosevelt was doing more than describing an attack. He was rendering a verdict, declaring that what Japan had done was not merely strategically threatening, but morally wrong. The speech was, in its deepest sense, an exercise in moral framing, an attempt to ensure that Americans understood the war, not as a geopolitical conflict, but as a struggle between right and wrong. This moral clarity came at a cost. It encouraged Americans to see their enemies as evil, rather than as human beings, acting on their own complex mix of motives and fears. It made possible the dehumanization that would characterize so much of the Pacific War, the racist propaganda, and the brutal treatment of prisoners, and the eventual decision to drop atomic bombs on civilian populations. Roosevelt could not have foreseen all of this when he chose the word infamy, but he must have understood, at some level, that he was summoning forces that would be difficult to control once released. The attack on Pearl Harbor remains, 8 decades later, one of the defining moments in American history. It is invoked whenever disaster strikes, whenever the nation feels threatened, whenever leaders seek to summon the spirit of unity and sacrifice that characterized the war years. And always, at the center of that invocation, stands Roosevelt's speech, its phrases worn smooth by repetition, but still carrying some echo of their original power. Yet what we remember is only part of what happened. We remember the polished words, the measured tones, the statesman addressing his nation in its hour of crisis. We forget the man who said no when he first heard the news, who asked, "How did this happen?" Who spent a sleepless night scratching out phrases and writing new ones until he found the words that history would preserve. We forget that great speeches are made, not born. that eloquence is the product of labor and revision and the careful elimination of everything that does not serve the purpose at hand. What Roosevelt really said when Pearl Harbor was attacked was everything he felt and feared and hoped for in those terrible hours. It was the sum of his anger and his grief, his determination and his doubt. The famous speech was only the refined extract, the distilled essence of emotions too complex to be fully captured in words. Behind every memorable phrase lay countless others that were discarded, deemed too raw or too honest or too revealing of the man behind the mask. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the story. Leadership in crisis requires not just courage, but performance, not just conviction, but the ability to shape that conviction into words that will move others to action. Roosevelt's genius was not that he felt no fear on that December afternoon. It was that he transformed his fear into something that could be shared and channeled, that could unite a fractured nation in common purpose. The speech was not a window into his soul. It was a carefully crafted tool designed to accomplish specific ends. And in that gap between the private man and the public performance lies much of what we need to understand about the nature of power. The voices of that day have long since fallen silent. Roosevelt himself died in April of 1945. Just months before the war, he led America into finally ended. Harry Hopkins followed soon after, his fragile body at last giving way. Eleanor lived until 1962, continuing her work for human rights until the end. The young men who died at Pearl Harbor, the sailors and soldiers and Marines, left behind only names carved in marble and photographs that grow more distant with each passing year. But the words remain, a date which will live in infamy. They have outlasted the men who spoke them and the men who heard them, and the immediate crisis that called them forth. They have become part of the language itself, available to be quoted and adapted and applied to new situations that Roosevelt could never have imagined. And yet, preserved within those famous words, there is still something of the raw emotion of that December afternoon. The shock, the fury, the determination, the fundamental human response to sudden, devastating loss. What Roosevelt really said was everything that words can say in the face of catastrophe. It was the attempt, forever imperfect, forever partial, to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in the midst of chaos. And in that attempt, with all its limitations, there is something that transcends the specific circumstances of 1941. There is something that speaks to the perennial human challenge of facing the worst and finding, somehow, the will to go on. The story of Pearl Harbor has been told many times, from many angles, by many voices. But the story of what was really said, in the private hours before the public performance, reminds us that history is made by human beings, with all their flaws and contradictions and moments of doubt. The Roosevelt of the speech was heroic. The Roosevelt of the night before was simply human. And perhaps it is in the distance between those two figures that we find the truest understanding of what leadership means. There are countless other stories like this one, moments when the private reality diverged from the public memory, when the words that were preserved were only part of what was said. History is full of such hidden depths, waiting to be discovered and shared. And if we listen carefully, we can still hear their echoes, still learn from the struggles and triumphs of those who came before.